Hello everyone, it's Sam Herbert here. This is a short presentation that I've prepared on context, what it means in contemporary art and related terms. And I've also got some images to share with you of how context is used by a variety of painters. Firstly, let's establish what context means. I've got the Oxford Dictionary's definition of context here. They write it's the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. To illustrate that, I've chosen a very familiar image to us all, that it's something that we looked at last week when we were dealing with the ready-made. The image on the left-hand side is Marcel Duchamp's famous fountain from 1917 that only exists as the photograph by Alfred Stieglitz. The original was lost. And on the right, we have an example of the Trenton Potteries Company's ceramic urinal from 1906. It's installed at the Magic Chef Mansion in St. Louis, USA. What that is, believe it or not, is the only example that anyone has found of the urinal that Duchamp chose to turn into fountain in 1917. That there are no other documented examples of this urinal that we know of in the world. It was discovered by the research of Adam Amor and Lucy Thompson. Their research is online, you can look that up, but that is where it is. Now, I use this as context because it neatly summarizes what context is. That basically the intended context of the urinal is the one on the right. The new context is the one on the left. What Duchamp has done is he has, if we were talking about this in correct art terminology, we would say that Duchamp has decontextualized the urinal. So if you look at the second bullet point there, decontextualize means considering something in isolation from its original context. So it's isolated from being in a men's room. It's isolated from being plumbed in. It's been turned around. It's lost that context. It's been taken out of its original context. By being removed from its original context, it becomes ripe for the next one. The next term is recontextualize, the third term there, recontextualize. And that means to change the meaning of something by changing its context. So the context has changed, and Duchamp changed that context when he chose that as an artwork. When he said this is an artwork, when he put it into a gallery, when he put it on a pedestal, when he changed its orientation, he recontextualized it. It meant that it took on another meaning. So that is a set of terms that you will encounter a lot as art students, as artists, when you read about art, particularly artists who use images, who use found images, or they use found objects. These three words will be there. You won't have to go far from talking or reading or writing about them before you encounter these words. What follows is some examples of how this plays out in the work of painters, because painters do use found images, that we live in a world of images, and those images are there to be exploited, and artists have done that. And the context of those images changes radically when they're put into the art world, very similar to what happens to Duchamp's urinal. So let's go through that. To begin with, we'll talk about Rauschenberg, Robert Rauschenberg. Now, as we saw last week, Rauschenberg made combine paintings and sculptures in the 1950s, where he was basically combining junk with paint into three-dimensional objects. By the 60s, he was experimenting with a silkscreen process, using images that he found from the press and newspapers in the same way that he was using three-dimensional junk that he found within the urban environment of New York City. By combining these found images, their context has changed. So there's a great example of recontextualization. Now, to explain a bit more about how this recontextualizing works, I'm going to move on, and I'll skip back to this image and I'll talk a bit more about it. But let's look at the original context of some of those images that are in this painting, silkscreen, call it what you like. It's a, well, it will effectively describe it as a painting because it's on the scale of a painting. It's understood as a painting. Here's the images in their original context. The Astronaut is by Ralph Morse from Time Life Pictures from 1963. And the image of Kennedy comes from this debate, which was the second presidential debate in October 1960. The actual press photo, I don't know, nobody's actually sourced that, but we have this image that is very similar. Kennedy's making a very similar gesture with his hand, that pointing. So it could well be the same image taken from a TV camera perspective. When we look at them, we see them as discrete objects. Their context remains exactly as it was intended, that they exist within their own context. They don't have anything else, any contamination of that context between them. When we see it played out in the Rauschenberg, however, something radical has happened there. They've been recontextualized. Recontextualizing happens because they are crammed together in the same painting. We are meant to read them as interacting with one another. Whereas when we look at this image, you could look at them and say that they don't look any different to how they would be if we saw them in a magazine on opposite pages with different captions. We don't necessarily make any big play of the fact that they're together. Obviously, the Astronaut does have some relationship to Kennedy, that the Kennedy administration is very much associated with the space race and something about technology and moving forward. But we don't read it in the same way here. When they're put here, they have suddenly merged into something else. They've been recontextualized. The meaning has changed completely. What was implicit here becomes explicit here. The relationship between Kennedy, the relationship between the Astronaut becomes very, very important. It's also interesting to look at the date 1963. This was actually done in the wake, in very, very soon after the assassination of Kennedy. So it's full of a totally, I mean, if you think about it, had this been painted in 1961, it would have had a completely different meaning to being painted in November, December 1963 in the wake of the assassination, that suddenly it becomes a rather tragic painting, that the things in it, their context is completely changed and changed in, you know, for anyone who knows their history of the 20th century, you know, it could be argued that maybe the youth of today or people who didn't grow up with the idea of Kennedy wouldn't be that familiar with the tragedy that's associated with him. So in that sense, the context is malleable, it does change, but the meaning of it is something quite tragic, something about loss comes across very, very powerfully here. The work's called Retroactive. It was made in 1963. I know Rauschenberg wasn't sure whether he should make this. I think he had the silk screens actually made before the assassination. So Kennedy was still alive when he made them. He wasn't sure whether he should go ahead and do these, but he did, and they stand as a very, very powerful monument to Kennedy, and also the idea of recontextualizing. Closely related to this is the idea of repetition. So we're still in the 60s, we're still in New York like Rauschenberg, and this time we're looking at Andy Warhol, so a slightly different artist in some respects. And this is such a famous work, the Marilyn Diptych from 1962. Everyone knows this, it's so famous. The repetition of Marilyn's head. Again, someone who's linked to Kennedy, someone who's also got a kind of American tragedy written into them. It's interesting when you look at what image that Warhol used originally. It was this one. It was a publicity still of Marilyn Monroe for Niagara, a movie that she made in 1953, and it was a black and white photograph. On its own, the image stands for something completely different than the Maryland diptych, when it's repeated so many times like that, when we know the backstory of Marilyn Monroe, when we know she died before her time in kind of rather tragic circumstances, it is the context around it has been recontextualized, that everything has changed. Whereas looking at it in its original context, in the publicity still, it is what it is. There isn't much more to it than a glamorous shot of a glamorous 1950s actress, Marilyn Monroe. So something really crucial, really important happens in this process of decontextualizing and recontextualizing images. And that's what using found images or existing press images can offer a painter. And that's what Warhol's doing, and it's something very similar to what Rauschenberg did as well. It's very closely linked to appropriation. Now, to talk about appropriation, we're fast forwarding 20 years, so a very long time in terms of like art practice and ideas. And it was a very different world that these works were made in. It's the work of Sherry Levine, who we discussed last week. She's a very famous American appropriation artist. And this is a work that she made called After Egon Schiele. Now, these are not her own drawings of Egon Schiele, they're not even watercolors. They are photos that she re-photographed Egon Schiele's watercolors and had them framed, and then they are exhibited as a bank of images. So they're not seen on their own, they're installed as a group. Interestingly, they're photographed from reproductions in a catalogue. They're not photographed from the originals. So Sherry Levine is talking about authenticity here. She's talking about certain romantic ideas of the artist as creator. She's challenging those. She's challenging the male dominance of these ideas of the artist as a tortured individual that's usually a man, and the subjectivity of that is very much about being a man. So she's taking a feminist approach to this and undermining, not so much undermining Egon Schiele's work, but more or less the way Egon Schiele's work is received in the latter part of the 20th century. I don't think she's saying at all that it isn't appropriate in its own context, which was Vienna of just before the war, First World War, but the way Schiele has been consumed and has been almost detached from that original context he had. She's playing with that Schiele has become commodified, and you can buy postcards of Schiele, you can buy catalogs, posters, and she's making a comment on that the original meaning of Schiele has completely changed to us because of consumerism. And it's bound up in all these ideas of the male and the romantic myth of the suffering artist that Schiele very succinctly represents. The next one is Kennedy again, so it's quite good to have Kennedy here, but it's an idea of how collage can be used and scaling up an image. So this is James Rosenquist, similar era to Warhol and particularly Rauschenberg. I think they're about the same age, actually. And this is one of his most famous works. It's called President-Elect. Again, it was made in the wake of Kennedy's assassination. And the painting is huge. It's enormous. It won't surprise you to know that Rosenquist's day job before he went full-time as an artist was as a sign painter. In Los Angeles, they were huge, and sort of billboard technology wasn't quite up to scratch in those days. So people were employed to paint enormous billboards advertising things. That was what Rosenquist did, and he used his day job in his painting practice. And so you can see the size of this thing. It's a very, very big painting. It's a triptych, actually. It's 3 canvases put together, but it's enormous. It's very, very big. It's based on the source image here, which is just images that he found in magazines or just political flyers or adverts that he's collaged together in actually a rather crude way. it's something that is worth looking at is actually the liberties he's taken, that there's a lot of his decision making has happened between that collage and the painting, yet he has used the grid. So the grid is quite important. If you notice there, you can see a pencil grid that he's drawn over it. The reason he did that was to help him scale it up onto this massive scale. I suppose today you could use a projector as well, but he's worked that with a grid. So again, thinking about the context here, the context of those three images on the left is again totally different to what happens when Rosenquist throws them all together in his own little mixer, that they become something different, quite powerful, particularly because you can't avoid the sociological context of these things, that it's of a recently assassinated president, and it's seen as quite a tragedy. The way that he's worked consumer objects with Kennedy, it's open-ended what that means, and also the way that he's playing with color is very sophisticated there. This is a very sophisticated compositional devices that he's using this painting. As a painting, it's visually very sophisticated. The use of color is very strong. So it holds together very well as a painting, but he's done that rather than as an abstract expressionist would, inventing things and just working in a spontaneous way. He's been a little bit more premeditated in working from sketches, but it's still developed itself into a really powerful painting. Following on from that, I've got a few more contemporary examples to show you here. This is an example of a British painter called Dexter Dallwood. The painting on the left is a large painting. Again, you can see it's well over 2 meters large, so it's very, very big, called Kurt Cobain's Greenhouse. The painting, the collage on the right is the source for that painting. It's collage magazines and mixed media, and it's only 34 by 38 centimeters. So it's a tiny source image that he works up into this enormous painting here. The same way that Rosenquist has taken some liberties and changed the color, he's changed the contrast, he's moved things about slightly, simplified things. Dallwood's done exactly the same thing to make it work as a painting. But essentially, the composition is more or less intact. He hasn't done a great deal to that other than work the color in a way that makes it hold together visually as a painting. So that is made up of, I believe, what he uses primarily are things like the IKEA catalogue and holiday brochures and magazines, glossy magazines, and just cuts these things together and creates these worlds, these places that we've all heard of but never seen. So an interesting artist to do a bit more research on there if you find that of interest. And then we have an image by Sigmar Polke, a very famous postmodern German artist, and he died recently. Here's an example of how he would use found images in his painting. So that is actually, it's, what have I put here? Oil and resin on fabric. So it's on a fabric that is transparent. He's treated it with a resin. It's quite mysterious, actually. Some of the fact that it's a kind of wizard isn't incidental, because a lot of the elements he used in his paintings were very mysterious. But if you want to talk about recontextualizing, have a look on the right, because that's the image that this originally came from. That it's a 1802 playbill, so it's quite different. Well, I mean, it's totally different on the right to what he's done with it on the left. So again, another nice example of how to change the context. In case you're wondering how he got the image on there, it isn't done with a silkscreen process like Rauschenberg or Warhol. It's actually done meticulously with very small brushes and a projector. That these took him a very, very long time to do. As you can see, the scale of it is, again, it's not a huge painting. And he would have done that all by hand. The line work would have been done all by hand, painstakingly from a projector. So he's taken a found image and he's done something to it. Through the act of recontextualizing it, he's done something very creative with it, and he's created it, he's made it his own, that it's become something else. That's the last slide I've got there. I hope that's helped you understand a bit more about what context means, and in particular, how artists recontextualize images by taking them and turning them into something else. I look forward to seeing the images that you're able to make in your own paintings in the studio coming up. So good luck with that, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.